ॐ शुक्लाम्बरधरं विष्णुं शशिवर्णं चतुर्भुजं प्रसन्नवदनं ध्यायेत् सर्वविघ्नोपशान्तये. ॐ. Dear friends, good morning. Welcome to the study of, or rather understanding Hinduism. This is the fourth class which we are having. And in the last three classes, I told about how Hinduism is rather unique in the sense that this is not a religion in the normal sense of the word. That is, it is not something which is based on a belief system. Usually, religion means it talks about a God, it talks about somebody who is an adversary to God, and then God stays in heaven, and then we are all here, and then we are all supposed to worship God. He takes away all our sins, etc., etc. So that is a normal religion. Take any religion, that is a normal structure, and you believe in that. You have to believe in that God. So you can't believe in anybody else, and you can't think of anybody else. You can't question also. You cannot question about the validity of what is told, or who that gentleman is, or anything like that. And I was telling about how our Hindu dharma, or Sanatana dharma, or Hindu religion as such, it is something which is based on the philosophical thought of the Upanishads. And Upanishads, I was also telling that it is a very honest inquiry into the nature of reality. What is that highest reality, what we call God? What is that? Is it a person sitting somewhere in heaven? Or is what is the nature? So that is the honest inquiry made by our rishis. Rishis means our sages of the past. And they have told certain things. And I was telling you in the last three classes about how they attempted this question in a very, very rational way and answered the question in a very rational way. And they said that God, what we call by the name ultimate reality, is not somebody who is a person. It is not even a person. It is a sort of impersonal entity, which is the infinitely existing consciousness. So that is what I explained to you. And what about all the gods? All of the gods, they are all visualizations in that infinite reality, in that supreme consciousness. Whatever God you visualize, and we are also seeing that the whole universe is a manifestation in that consciousness, and that consciousness has got a manifesting power. And I also told you how it is very closely related to the question which is there right now in modern physics. The modern physics also, it is now trying to know whether matter is primary or intelligence is primary, whether intelligence or consciousness is appearing as matter, or consciousness is something which is appearing from or originating from matter. So this is something which is even now the science is questioning, and of course science will go on questioning until they get a totally foolproof doubt. But then philosophers, our Vedanta, not philosophers means I don't mean Western philosophers, our Vedanta, our Upanishad philosophers, they said that consciousness is something which is primary, and that consciousness is what is appearing as this matter. And in that consciousness, there is also an energy, and that energy is appearing as this universe. And in this universe, there are so many forces, and those forces which are helping us to sustain our body mind complex, and how the body mind complex has arisen from from the five elements, and from the what is called the sattva guna, rajoguna, and tamo guna of the five elements. Our body mind complex has evolved, etc. All that thing, how the body mind complex has evolved, no religion will tell you, because it is a philosophical approach. Because of this philosophical approach, they have given certain, let us say, postulations or hypotheses about, yes, this is the way. So this is what I was explaining to you, and I was also saying how this philosophical approach has given rise to a unity in our society. That is, there were so many traditions. There were so many traditions like Vishnu tradition, Shiva tradition, Shakti tradition, and Ganesha tradition, maybe several traditions. And these traditions have been harmonized. They have been harmonized in a very peaceful manner. I was telling you how Shankaracharya moved all over the country. He is called Shanmata Sthapanacharya. I also told that he is said to have started, not started, Sthapana, not exactly started. He is said to have stabilized or harmonized six religions. That means he did not start them afresh. They were already existing. They were already existing. He merely harmonized them. He said all of these things you worship in whatever form you want, you are worshipping that supreme reality. If you are worshipping Vishnu, you are worshipping that supreme reality. If you are worshipping Shiva, you are worshipping that supreme reality. Or Shakti, you are worshipping the same supreme reality. So that is how he harmonized all these traditions. So this is where we were. And I will now share the screen because I have also got some slides like in the earlier classes. Yeah, this was the first say slide, and from here we moved on, and then I think we were there somewhere in 29 or yeah. The one important thing which we saw in the last class was a sort of misunderstanding that we have some 330 million gods. It's a very absolutely stupid idea. Totally due to misunderstanding. I was just telling you how this 33 crore koti means a category. And what are those categories? I was telling you about the names like Vasu, Rudra, Aditya, etc. For that, I also gave reference of this Shakalya Brahmanam of Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Then I also told about the historical background. What is the historical background? We have got a harmonizing approach. We don't have a divisive approach. And whenever a new religion came in other parts of the world, they wiped out the existing religions. It did not happen in India. So these are the things which I told. And then again, the schools, the three schools in Vedanta, I just very briefly mentioned that one is called the Advaita school. Advaita means that only consciousness, supreme consciousness, the highest reality is what is called consciousness, and that is manifesting as the whole universe. And of course, Ramanujacharya and other people, slightly they modified. They said, no, the world is also real. The world is also real, but both the consciousness and also the Jagat, they are both existing in one entity called Narayana. So that is Vishishta Advaita. Chita Achid Vishishta Advaita. Vishishta means qualified. Qualified by what? Chid Achid Vishishta means both Chit and Achit. That is both sentient and insentient. They are both there in one. And of course, Madhvacharya and others, they say that no, these are totally different. Chaitanya is different, and the matter is different, and there is so total division. So that is what they approach. But anyway, whatever they are, we all agree that we all worship all these deities as that supreme reality. Of course, the Madhva and these dualist traditions, they talk about only one, that is Narayana only, and all other people are inferior gods. Even then, they don't say that, okay, Vishnu is the only god and Shiva is a demon. They don't say that. Shiva also is a god. But then they say that, yes, Shiva is also a good friend of Vishnu or a sort of associate of Vishnu. So that is how they also accept him. So there is no disharmony, there is no fight or anything. Of course, you may say there were some fights between Shaivas and Vaishnavites in the Middle Ages. That is because we came away from the Upanishadic philosophy. Because when we forgot the Upanishad, the society forgot the Upanishadic philosophy, then people started quarreling. And that too, when kings also, they took up the cause of either Vaishnavites or Shaivites. So that is what has happened in Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, etc., not in all other parts of the country. So now we come to the next, we will not go into those details. We will now come to an important question. That this is an important criticism against the Hinduism. One of the most important points which are held against Hindus. Oh, you are worshipping so many idols. You are worshipping so many, you are worshipping a rock, you are worshipping a wooden piece, you are worshipping something else. So it is looking as though we are just going and worshipping that rock, which is an idol. So what exactly is the fact? Why this thing has come into existence? We know that all over the world we had these idols of gods, etc. Before the advent of Christianity. We see that Roman gods, how the pictures of all the Roman gods, sometimes mutilated and sometimes intact. We see all those things. So all over the world we had these gods. So, but then similarly we also had these gods. Why do we have this? So if you just go back to the Vedic period and see, I will just slightly make it big. Yeah, the Vedas, they talk at three levels. That is, the Vedas, basically, they have to take into account all the people. They have to take into account the common man. They have to take into account a slightly educated man. They should also take into account a highly evolved person, a philosopher, a person who is a thinker. So for all these categories, they talk at three levels. One is at the level of just a ritual. An ordinary man who has to go to a temple, he has to perform some puja, or he may or may not go to the temple, he may perform puja in his own house. So that is the type of thing for an ordinary man. Okay, you please do this, you do this ritual and you will get some punya. And that ritual is basically an exercise in instilling some good habits. Suppose you are performing a ritual. When in the course of that ritual, you are doing some dhanam, you are giving some gift to some poor man, you are giving some food to some poor people. So in that manner, some good practices where they are inculcated in a person. So that ritual, the importance of ritual is that. And the next level, you just don't, the Upanishads also say, Upanishads and also the Vedas say that a person should not rest contented at that level of ritual. Otherwise, life will have no meaning. So a person keeps on performing a ritual, will only say, okay, I am getting some punyam, etc. He is only thinking about some heaven and all the heavenly pleasures. And again, after the punyam is over, again you have to come back. So that is the basic structure of karma. Once we do some punya, according to that good merit, meritorious conduct, we attain some heaven for some time. And after that punyam is exhausted, again we come back. It is somewhat like having a sort of debit card. You are having a debit card, and depending on the value of the debit card, we stay there for some time, and then again after the account, after the amount is over, then again we come back. So, but then that cycle goes on and on and on, birth and death cycle. So the Upanishads also say that don't stay at that level only. You come to a higher level where you are trying to contemplate on that nature of reality. So for that, you have to do that contemplation. Contemplation, in other words, you have to meditate on that nature of reality. Suppose you talk about some Vishnu. So that Vishnu, you have visualized, okay, yes, Vishnu is somebody who is Vishwa Vyapnoti iti Vishnu. When the etymological definition is Vyapnoti. That is, he is all pervading. That is what Vishwam Vishnu Vashatkaru. You see that very first line, Vishwam Vishnu. The whole universe is Vishnu. The whole universe, whatever thing we see, is that Vishnu. So that Vishnu, when you are visualizing, you have to visualize in a particular way. You have to visualize some form which is going to represent the whole universe. So that is how a philosophical concept we are trying to translate into some sort of mantra or some sort of diagram or some such thing. I'll just tell you about that. So ritual is that level. The second level is that meditation. And the philosophical inquiry, that is the highest, the straightforward philosophical inquiry. That is, who am I? What is my body-mind complex? How this has come into existence? What is meant by pranamaya kosha? What is meant by annamaya kosha? Etc. etc. This is the philosophical inquiry. So the second level of meditation on this deity is what we are concerned with here in the case of idols. The second level of meditation, second level is a meditation on a deity, is described by some Vedic mantra. In other words, what we call bhakti. So Vedic mantras, they talk about various deities. For example, there is some Agni mantra, there is some Surya mantra, there is some other mantra for some other deity. So these mantras, they are given in order to, when we are asked to meditate on that mantra, on the meaning of that mantra, you are focusing your mind. When you are, the quality or the habit of focusing our mind is very important. So for that reason, these mantras are given. And a mantra, originally, it was supposed to be before the evolution of these temples. Even in Ramayana time, we don't find that great temple culture. Chaityam, there is some mention that there are some places of worship, but then there is no description of a big temple or any such thing. So in Ramayana, whereas in the Mahabharata time, then you get a lot of description. In Mahabharata time, in the story of Mahabharata, when Balarama goes on pilgrimages and then he touches almost all the places in the country during his course on pilgrimage. So all those places are described, and at that place, all the shrines, etc. There is a mention of the shrines. Whereas at the time of Ramayana, they were still probably in the developmental stage. So now we see that mantra was actually considered as a sort of temple for the, or rather the body of that particular god, temple or the body of the deity. And later in course of time, somebody, they started a small symbol and somebody prepared a small yantra and it gradually took the shape of an idol. And this, what I said, the idea of God becomes the idol of God. And then this is explained very clearly in our Upanishads. There is one Upanishad called Ramata Apaniya Upanishad. So there is a mantra which says, Chinmayasya Advitiyasya Nishkalasya Asharirinaha Upasakanam Karyartham Brahmano Rupakalpana. All this visualizing a shape, it is merely to facilitate meditation. So that is what it says. Then we see different gods. This also again we see different types of gods in our hierarchy, not exactly hierarchy, in our pantheon, what we call it. Say, what is this? Deva, the word Deva means, Divu means Dyotanam. Dyotanam means shining, which that which shines, figuratively, that which denotes intelligence or consciousness. So that is what is Deva. So that is the reason why our Indriyas are also called Devas. Our Indriyas, they are also called, Indriyas means sense organs. My sense of sight, my sense of smell, my sense of touch, these senses, because with the help of this sense, with the help of the sense organs, I am able to know, I am able to perceive, I am able to get intelligence of the external things. And not intelligence, get knowledge of that external things. And my mind is what is processing all this information which has been secured or procured by these five senses. So the mind also is involved in this gathering of knowledge. So this Deva is something which figuratively means denoting intelligence or consciousness. So we see in this gods, broadly we can put them in three categories. One is the Vedic gods. Vedic gods means that Indra, Varuna, Vayu, Agni, etc., etc. If you see Rigveda. And Rigveda, for your information, it's now available online. You can download it straight away. Somebody has translated it into English. But I don't recommend you to read the translation. If you read the translation only, you will find just pure, simple translation into English without reference to what it is, without any explanation of what it means. It just doesn't make much sense. But then it is available on that it gives a broad structure. If you want to have a very broad understanding of what is Rigveda, etc., that thing is available on the net also. So these Vedic gods, Indra, Varuna, Vayu, Agni, etc., and these are like various cosmic manifestations. Indra in the Vedic times, that is supposed to be the highest of all the deities. Vayu, the wind. Wind is also supposed to be a very powerful thing. And wind is something which we invariably need. Every second we are breathing air and we are breathing out air. And what is called that Prana Shakti is from that wind only. And wind also, that is Vayu, is also responsible for the sense of touch, according to our these arguments in Upanishads. Then fire Tejas. Tejas is something which is related to our eyesight. So like this, what we see in the external world is something which is corresponding to the five senses. This also we saw earlier, the evolution of the five senses. In that I explained how the five senses relate to the sattva aspect of the five elements outside. Outside means outside us, that is in the prakriti or in the nature or in the universe. So these are treated as divine because our sense organs and mind, they correspond to them. And here only this 33 type gods, they are also covered. Vasu is something to do various forces which help sustenance of our body. So they are the Vasus. The sense organs and the mind, they are called the Rudras. Adityas are those things which are related to intelligence and also which are related to the spending away of our body. Adadana gachanti. That is the gradual say depletion of our lifetime, and then that goes away. That which is associated with our gradual decline. So these are the things which we see. Then different gods you see. Then again, the second type are various predominant traditions, such as Vishnu tradition, Shiva tradition, etc. They are brought under the umbrella of the Upanishads by later texts like what are called mythologies. In English also, we have got various mythological stories. In India, of course, abundance. Probably nowhere else in the world are there so many mythologies. We have got Nrsimha, Vamana, and so many things. All these are mythological gods. For example, say this Shiva, Vishnu, they are all mythological gods. Then there are certain historical figures like Rama, Krishna, and of course Hanuman also. Hanuman. All these people, we treat them as gods, and Sita, goddess. So like that, these are the avatars of Vishnu. These are the avatar, means the incarnation of Vishnu, because they come, avatar means avatarana means coming down, avatara means coming down. What for? Coming down to, in order to establish dharma. That is what we see in the Gita also, coming down to earth or taking human birth in order to say establish dharma in the society. So that is what we see about the avatar. So altogether, we have got three types. I'll go to the back slide, earlier slide. Earlier slide we saw the Vedic gods, Indra, Varuna, which are the cosmic manifestations. Number two is the predominant traditions which were already there in the society. For example, Vishnu, Shiva, and other traditions, Ganesha, Parvati, and other traditions. And again, the third is the historical figures like Rama, Krishna, etc. They are called the avatars of Vishnu because they have come for the purpose of establishing dharma. So broadly speaking, we can put all our gods into these three categories. Then now we come to another important point. That is, if you see all other religions, they have got mainly one text. They have just got one text. If you see Christians, they have got a Bible, and all other books, they are all elaborations or something common on the Bible. And if you see Islam, there is only one book, that is Quran, and various other things like hadiths, etc. They are by later writers. But if we see if you come to our books, we find so many books which are said to be all ancient books. So many books. We see Vedas, we see, of course, Upanishads are part of Vedas. We see a very huge book called Mahabharata with 100,000 verses. If you see the Mahabharata text itself, it is of this size. Then you find Ramayana, you find Srimad Bhagavatam, you find 18 Puranas, main Puranas, and among them is one Skanda Purana, which is almost as big as Mahabharata. So like that, very huge texts go anywhere. So if you want to see, if you want to find out what exactly is the totally representative, wholly representative text of Hinduism, you come across so many books. So we have to know, if we don't want to get confused, we should know what are the basic primary books and what are the secondary books. And this is luckily, this is done by Vyasa and Valmiki, right from earlier days. So this sort of hierarchy has been established. So right now, the first line is the people of the book and people of the library. Because the Christians and the Muslims, they are called the people of the book because they have a book only. But then we don't have one book. We have got a huge library. We are the people of the library. That is what Swami Dayananda Saraswati said in a rather witty way. And then what are the primary books? Vyasa and Valmiki, they mention. In fact, Vyasa in Mahabharata, if you see Mahabharata, in the very first sarga, in the very first adhyaya, there is one line, Itihasa Purana Bhyam Vedam Samupa Brahmayet. So he says, Veda is the most primary thing, and that Veda has to be taken to the people. Or taken to the people in the sense that it has to, the Vedas is in a rather complicated language. So they have to be told in a normal language, whatever is the message of the Vedas, it has to be conveyed, it has to be expanded. Some Upabrahmanam means elaborating, expanding on it. Veda may tell in a short manner, but then you have to expand it and then give some illustrations, etc. All those things have to be done by the other texts. Itihasa Purana Bhyam. Itihasa Mahabharata and Ramayana, they are called the Itihasas because they are mostly historical, based on history only. Rama and Krishna, they are basically historical characters, not mythological characters. And mythology also is again a secondary text. Mythology means, when we talked about Vishnu Purana, Shiva Purana, then Ganesha Purana, various Skanda Purana, Agni Purana, Vayu Purana. There are 18 main Puranas. So like that, Vyasa and Valmiki also says, Vedopa Brahmanarthaya, he says, Valmiki. That is, in order to elaborate the meaning of the Veda, Valmiki told that particular Ramayana to Lava and Kusha. So that is what he says. So what is the primary text? That is what is called Shruti. Primary text is called Shruti. That is Veda. Veda is called Shruti because Vedas, according to conventional view, I'm just telling the conventional view and also the modern view. According to the conventional view, Vedas are something which are directly from the God, which have just evolved as a sort of breath from the Lord. Whereas the modern view is that Vedas, of course, they were written sometime in about 5,000 years ago. And how were they written? That is, these various sages, they were in their contemplation. They were just trying to know what is the reality. And in their tapas or in their contemplative stage, they had certain revelations. Yes, this is the truth. And those revelations, they are reflected, they are written down, or rather not written down. At that time, the Vedas were not written down. They were just revealed. They were just told to their students. So these rishis, they told their students, and then they just, in that Guru Shishya tradition, they preserved the text till now, till recently, till this Max Muller got them printed. So the Vedas, that is called the Shruti. Shruti means something which has been heard. And the secondary text, that is basing on the Vedas, whatever has been written, whatever books have come later, they are called the Smriti. Smriti means, it comes from the word Smaranam. Smaranam means remembering. Smarana. Vismarana means forgetting. Smarana means remembering. Smriti means something which has been remembered or said, recalled. Recalled from what? Recalled from the primary text. Whatever has been told in the Vedas, they are again elaborated with the Vedas tell in a very brief manner, whereas the secondary text, they explain in a more detailed manner. So these are called the secondary texts. So this is the structure which we have right from the beginning. And when there is some sort of conflict between the Shruti and the Smriti, that is between the primary text and the secondary text, the primary text prevails. In case of any doubt, in case there is some odd statement somewhere, some odd say description somewhere, which is not totally in accordance with the Shruti, not in accordance with the philosophy of the Shruti, then the Shruti prevails and not the Smriti. So this is general structure. And we see, primary and secondary texts. Vedas, they are illustrated through Itihasa and Puranas. Stories, this Itihasa and Purana. Itihasa, as I said, it is mostly historical in nature. And Puranas, they are mostly, and quite often, they are quite symbolic. We are going to see how all those symbolic stories, etc. I have also given some examples of those symbolic stories. So they are quite often allegorical or symbolic. And they are also illustrated by, these Vedas are also illustrated by the Dharma Shastras. One is Itihasa, one is Purana, the other is Dharma Shastra. Dharma Shastra, most of us have heard the name of Manusmriti, the much maligned Manusmriti. Much maligned because the people who burn Manusmriti, they don't know what is there in the book. And people who praise Manusmriti also, most of us, we don't know Manusmriti. So anyway, that Manusmriti was brought into focus by the British people. In fact, most of us, we don't even know Manusmriti. We are not even following Manusmriti, because if we want to follow Manusmriti, we have to totally change our lifestyle now. We have to totally change our lifestyle, and then say Brahmin he is asked to serve meat to his guests, and then like that. This is just one example. So that Manusmriti was somehow brought into focus by the British people, basically to quote some small passages here and there, not the entire text. The entire text has got so many brilliant verses, whereas all those brilliant verses we don't want. We only want those verses which say, okay, Nastri Swatantriyam Arhati. Okay, the woman has to be, she needs protection. She needs protection, and without protection, she can come to danger. So something like that, you quote. And then we say, oh, the India, in olden days, they suppressed women, etc. Little just refusing to comment on some other people whose kind of say religion, the state of women is so atrocious, either so despicable. So anyway, they are also illustrated by the Dharma Shastras, which are code of ethics. These Dharma Shastras are also very many in number. Not only one, Manusmriti, Parashara Smriti, Yajnavalkya Smriti, like that, there are about 30 to 40 Smritis. Then, okay, the study of Vedas would be complete only by reading these later texts. That is, later texts. That is, if you read only Veda, then you will not understand the whole meaning of the Veda. That is what Vyasa says. Vyasa says, Itihasa and Purana have to be read by people. Otherwise, if you just read Veda only, you will not be able to properly understand, properly interpret. It is like law and case law. Suppose if you know something about law, there is what is called a definition of, say, theft. So what exactly constitutes theft? There are so many illustrations given. Oh, A did this on this particular circumstances. Does it constitute theft or not? So all the ingredients of the theft have to be there. So similarly, Vedas say, okay, Satyam Vada, Dharmanchara, Swadhyayan Ma Pramada, like that. So Satyam Vada, tell truth. Then what? Then the Puranas, they give so many stories about how people like Satyaharan, that Harishchandra, they told and they were great adherents to truth, and then how they came out very successful. At the end, they may, in the middle, they may suffer a little bit, they may suffer a lot also, but at the end, they shine, come back with great success. So similarly, Dhanam, Shibi, a man like Shibi, how he was a great example for Dhanam. So like that, Vedas elaborate. What is the Veda? Not Vedas. These Puranas give by their stories, by their innumerable stories. They elaborate. They give flesh and blood to what has been told in the Vedas. And so that is why the study of the Vedas will be complete only by the study of Itihasas and Puranas and also Dharma Shastras. Then the Vedas, according to tradition, they were revelations which happened to several sages. And these Vedas are said to have been classified by sage Vyasa. We know that sage Vyasa, he classified them into Rig Veda, Yajurveda, Samaveda and Yajurveda, Atharva Veda, depending on some peculiarities of that particular, of certain mantras. Because of the peculiar nature of certain mantras, they were all classified. Where only hymns means HYMNS hymns, they were all categorized as Rigveda. And where those hymns are applied to rituals, etc., they are called Yajurveda. Then again, some other hymns which are sung, they are called Samaveda, and this Atharva Veda. Atharva Veda again is where those mantras, they have been used for various practical purposes. So then, Rigveda is said to be the oldest document, oldest record of mankind, at least some 5,000 years old. This is accepted by all. And these Vedas, they include both philosophical inquiry and also popular beliefs, as I said, because we have to cover, the Vedas have to cover all levels of people. Then the initial portions of the Vedas, if you see the internal structure of the Vedas, you see, the initial portions of the Vedas, they talk about religious rites. For example, Yajna. All of us have heard about Yajna, Yajnam, or something like Yagam. At least the Yaga word we know, Chandi Yagam. That is a very famous, very popular Yagam. Or some other Yagam like Sudarshana Yagam. So most of us, we are familiar with these words like Yagam. And this Yagam, when we say that Yajna or Yaga, we recite various mantras. There are a few people, not one person who is conducting it, but at least some half a dozen people sitting and then each man saying something. So that is the Yajna. These Yajnas are mainly to discipline the common man. These Yajnas are rituals. Even ordinary, very, very ordinary example of ritual is some Satyanarayana Vratam we perform in our house, or some other Ganesha Vratam or Saraswati Vratam. When we perform these things in our house, okay, these are meant to inculcate some good habits in our minds. And in the Vedas, the beginning, as I said, in the beginning portions, they talk about yajnas. And then the middle portions, they also come to the level of meditations. That is mainly to enable a person to think at a higher level. You don't remain at that level of ritual only. Slightly come above. So that is the reason why if we see our really rituals also, they are structured in such a way. There are certain philosophical passages. Philosophical passages are told as a part of the ritual. And when we concentrate on the meaning, then gradually we realize, I didn't notice all these days. So then we realize, oh, this is the great meaning of what I have been chanting. So similarly, the end portions of the Vedas, they are called the Upanishads. Veda Anta. Anta means end. The end portions of the Veda, they are called Vedanta. Veda plus Anta. So they include or they consist of the philosophical inquiry into the nature of reality. And there is no design to start any religion. There are the Upanishad the sages, they did not have any design to start any religion. That is the reason why the Upanishads even now totally non-controversial. Totally non-controversial, and then they are accepted by the whole world. Yeah, I will also give some slides explaining that. Then philosophy, in that philosophy, what is the approach in those books? That is, in physics or in normal science, in science, what we do? What do? We observe the external world. Science observes the external world, whereas Vedanta observes the internal world. Internal world means who am I, the observer. So you are observing the observer. You are trying to observe or examine the nature of the observer. So that is observing the observer is something which is unique for the Indian thought. I think I made a mention of it even earlier. Whereas all the Western philosophy and religion, Western religion, they are disconnected. And in the Western philosophy also, this inquiry on the mind, what is human mind, that is not there till 18th century. Plato, sometime some 300 years BC, at that time, there is a theory called Plato's theory of cave. If you want to have an idea, you can just go to YouTube and then click it. Plato's theory of cave. Then it is somewhat closer to, because Socrates' guru, Plato's guru Socrates, he was a wandering monk. He was somewhat like a wandering monk. Probably he had some contact with Indian philosophy also. So Socrates and Plato, they are the only people who told something which is there in Indian philosophy. But later people, they only talked about all external world only. So the examination of external world is there in the Western philosophy, whereas examining the examiner or observing the observer is something which is unique to Indian thought. Then there is lot many people have praised Upanishads. For example, a great German philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer. So he says in the whole world, there is no study so beneficial and so elevating as that of the Upanishads. It has been the solace of my life and it will be the solace of my death. They are the product of the highest wisdom. So this gentleman, Arthur Schopenhauer, not only Schopenhauer, lot many people. And as I was telling you earlier also, there is a whole branch of thinkers in America. They are called the Boston Brahmins. You just click, go to Google and then click Boston Brahmins. You will find a great list starting from Emerson, Thoreau, and all those people. Much prior to the arrival of Vivekananda, or rather Vivekananda's entry into the US. Then the secondary text. Well, let us now come to the secondary text. All the way earlier we saw this Vedas and Upanishads. Now we see the secondary texts. As I said, the secondary texts are of three types: Itihasa, Purana, and the Dharma Shastras. Itihasa literally means it happened so. Iti, iha, asa. Iti, iha, asa. All the three words put together, it becomes Itihasa. So all this I am telling not for the kids. All this I am telling for the young parents. Right now, my target group for these episodes are young parents. Because all these things, if I tell kids, they will get confused. So the young parents, of course, they are already aware of what is Ramayana, what is Mahabharata. They are broadly aware that there are so many Puranas. They are broadly aware that there are not only Puranas, there are so many other texts, Dharma Shastras, etc. So where to place? What is the relative importance? How do you pigeonhole them? Or how to pigeonhole them? What is the relative importance? So if you want to know, all this is for the young parents. So the semi-historical epic texts, these are the Ramayana and Mahabharata. So the historical story is taken And then that is brought in the form of a sort of a heroic tale or some sort of, not exact, a heroic tale is a very narrow definition, a broad cultural vision for the whole society. Ramayana carries a broad cultural vision for the society. That is with an intention to guide the society for millennia. Similarly, Mahabharata also has a grand cultural vision for the society, and that is meant to guide the lives of people all over the country for thousands of years. And these characters, they are all living examples of certain ideals mentioned in the Vedas. For example, Rama. Rama is again a great example. Ramo Vigrahavan Dharma, it is said. He is said to be the personification of Dharma. Similarly, Dharmaraja in Bharatam. He is again Dharmaraja, the very personification of Dharma. So like that, we see the characters who personify so many things, so many points which are mentioned in the Vedas. Then the next point is, Puranas are more mythological in nature. They contain greater element of the supernatural. There is a lot of supernatural element, and then suddenly gods appearing, disappearing, and all these things. Ramayana, you don't see that. Rama doesn't appear, doesn't disappear. Rama is exactly like a very, very ordinary man. And he also undergoes all suffering like us, like all human beings. And he shows he is a sort of example in front of all of us as to how one has to face various things in life and how one has to, what should be the human relationship between brother and brother, relationship between father and son, relationship between husband and wife, relationship between master and servant, what type of relation. So all these relations are so beautifully illustrated in the Ramayana. And when the Puranas, you come to all these mythological stories. Oh, suddenly some god appearing and somebody giving a curse and things like that. And all these things, they are also meant to train a human being. They are also meant to morally uplift the human being. And we see that there are major Puranas are 18 in number and some others are secondary ones. Then major Puranas are Vishnu Purana, Shiva Purana, Agni, Skanda, etc., etc. There are so many, 18. And they are all said to have been written by Vyasa, but this point is contended. This is disputed by the modern critics. The traditional view is that they are all written by Vyasa. But the modern people, they do dispute, because in one Purana, Vishnu is praised as the supreme deity. And Shiva is called his assistant or his bhakta, devotee. If you take Shiva Purana, you take Shiva is the supreme deity, and Vishnu is somebody who is a friend of Shiva or somebody who is a follower of Shiva. And so like that. And if you take Shakti is the most important thing. She is the supreme reality. And Vishnu and all these people, they are her assistants. So one man writing all these things is something which is perplexing. So that is the reason why modern people, they say that it could have been written by various people who represented those particular traditions. They wanted to glorify their own tradition, and then they wrote these Puranas. So that is how the modern view is. Then when you come to this impact of these Puranas and also Idihasas, they are part of the collective memory. They are part of the collective memory of even the illiterate villagers. Even you go to a villager and then you ask, okay, even those people, that their moral fiber is basically drawn from these books only. Their innate morality of what we call in English middle class morality. So there is some truth in that. There is a villager, an innocent villager has got a lot of morality in him. So that is because of the impact of Ramayana, Mahabharata, and all these stories from various Puranas, etc. Though they are secondary in nature, they gave the ethical framework and value system for the society. And they have to be read. And one important point we have to see is these secondary texts like Itihasas and Puranas, they have to be read in the light of Upanishads. They have to be read in the light of the philosophy of the Upanishads. Otherwise, they may not be appreciated. They will be misunderstood or misinterpreted, like what some of these Western writers. Of course, they do it deliberately. Basically to bring about some sort of Arya Dravida divide, and some stories, Purana stories, they try to interpret in that way, a sort of racial interpretation of Puranas. So basically to bring about some division in the society. Then gods and demons. Yeah, this is again a very interesting thing. We have some time, some 10-15 minutes more. So gods and demons. What does it mean? We see that in the story of all these gods are there, and then in all our cinemas also we see gods, very well dressed people, very nice crowns and whatnot, and then all these demons coming in all ugly, fierce form. So what are these? So in fact, the philosophy, or rather the Upanishads, they take a philosophical view. Mythological stories, they describe all the grandeur of the gods and then all the ugly features of the demons. But then if you take the philosophical view, if you go to Upanishad gives a totally different view. Upanishads say that this battle between the good and evil, it is battle between gods and demons, is the battle between good and evil in the human mind. It says, for example, Chandogya Upanishad Bhashyam, there in that commentary Shankaracharya writes, he says, Deva Shastrodbhasita Indriya Vrittayaha, he says, Shastra Udbhasitaha Indriya Vrittayaha. That is our own thoughts which are refined by the study of Shastras, they are the gods. And our own unrefined base nature, not base nature, or basic instincts, let us say, they are the demons, and there is a clash in our own human mind. This human mind is the milk ocean, that milk ocean in which Lord Vishnu is said to be reclining. Lord Vishnu is said to be there in that milk ocean, and we are supposed to churn the milk ocean. When we churn the milk ocean, there may be poison in the beginning, but then when you churn more successfully or more persistently, then you are going to get this nectar, amrutam, which is the knowledge of the reality. So that is the knowledge of the supreme reality. So that is what is the symbolism about even the churning of ocean. Churning of ocean is, the milk ocean is nothing but our own human mind. When we say Manasa Sarovara, that is Sarovara, what we call the lake, that Manasa Sarovara is our own human mind. So in order to describe human mind, various images or rather metaphors have been mentioned. So this symbolic battle is that is something which is Anudinam Vartamanaha Adhyatmika Sangramaha, says Shankaracharya. Adhyatmika Sangrama is something which happens inside, in the human mind. Then heavenly worlds, what we call heaven and hell, according to Vedanta, when you go to a man of religion, he will say, "Oh, heaven means yes, there is a place called heaven." Whereas Vedanta says, heaven is here, hell is here, your own experience, your own next birth, let us say. Of course, Vedanta also accepts the Punarjanma, because Vedanta, it has to take into account the good and bad work of the people. If a person is doing doing some good things in life, of course, he will have some good result. If he is doing some bad things in life, he will have bad result. And that result, it cannot be exhausted in one life, so he will take up another life. So that is the reason why Vedanta accepts the concept of Punarjanma or rebirth. So the about heavenly worlds and all that, they are our own births, our own various births and our own human experiences. So these several allegorical episodes in Upanishads, they are there telling about the rivalry between gods and demons. For example, Purana. Purana is myth or symbolism, quite often mythology or symbolism. One popular, for example, I have given some stories here. One most popular worship of Shakti as goddess Lalita. Who is this goddess Lalita? Okay, Lalita Sahasranama we take. If we take Lalita Sahasranama, we find that Lalita goddess she is reclining. She is sitting on Shiva. Shiva is there. He is lying on a bed, and on Shiva, the Shakti is sitting. And then she is also having a sort of sugarcane bow in her hand. And there are 5 arrows also are there. So there is a description. Mano Rupekshu Godanda Pancha Tammatra Sayaka, etc. Some description is there. So what is the symbolism there? For example, if you don't know what is that symbolism, you will see, oh, what is this Lalita? There is one gentleman, Shiva, lying on a bed. And then on Shiva, this Shakti is sitting. She is attended by various other deities. She is having some sugar cane in her hand. What is so great about it? So then, What is the symbolism there? Shiva there represents what we call that supreme consciousness. And that consciousness is manifesting as the Shakti. And the Shakti is what is the supreme, this goddess Lalita. Shakti is that goddess Lalita. And that is why she is said to be sitting on Shiva. That means it is something which is, for that Shakti, the basis is that consciousness. In that consciousness only this is manifesting. So that Shiva is said to be the basis for this thing. And what is this bow? This sugarcane bow, the mind, Manorupa Ikshu Kodanda, Manas is Ikshu Kodanda. Ikshu means sugarcane. Ikshu Kodanda, the sugarcane, that cane is the mind. Ikshu is something why it is sweet, so sweet. That is something which is all our desires are fulfilled by the mind only. All our desires, of course, the mind desires and also mindful, it also gets fulfilled, the desires, enjoys those things. So all our desires, all our sukham, sukha, dukkha, etc., it is all experienced by the mind only. So this mind is shown as the sugarcane bow, and the 5 arrows are there. When there is a bow, naturally arrows have to be there, the 5 arrows. So sometimes my eye goes and hits something, or my sense of smell hits something else, and my sense of taste hits something else, and that is produced, that image is carried on to the mind. So the mind processes that information. So these arrows are the 5 senses are the arrows. Pancha Tanmatra Sayakaha. Pancha Tanmatra. This Pancha Tanmatras only are the Sayakaha. Sayaka means arrow. So like that, the symbolism has to be understood in all these pictures. So otherwise, okay, if you see the portrait of Lalita sitting on Shiva, we will say, okay, it is some funny thing. So if you know the symbolism, you will be able to explain to your child in a better way. For example, there is another story like Kama Dahanam. We know that Lord Shiva, his marriage had to be performed. It was a necessity. It was a necessity for gods, because there was one demon who was harassing the gods very much, and then he had also dethroned Indra and then sent away this Indra from heaven. So he had become someone demon had become the boss of all these gods, all the gods. So the gods, they run to Vishnu and then they say, okay, we need some protection. So Vishnu says, no, you have to wait for the time when Shiva has a son. Only a person who is born to Shiva will be able to kill this demon. So they have to perform the marriage of Shiva. So what happens that Shiva is he is doing some tapas. He is doing tapas in the Himalayas. So of course, to make the story short, because it's a very, very long story. If you want to listen to this long story, you may listen to some Purana. For example, people like most of the audience now, I think they are Tamilian, say Telugu people. So you might have heard about Samavedam Shanmukha Sharma telling Parvati Kalyana. Very, very beautiful way he tells. So that entire the symbolism he explains. I am just trying to give in a nutshell. So Parvati has to marry the Shiva. And Parvati, she tries to win him over by virtue of her beauty, by presenting herself in a very presentable way, by showing herself in a presentable way. She wants to win him through her beauty. But then Shiva is not a man who will be won over by beauty. And even this Cupid, the Kama, the Manmatha itself is a peculiar name, you see. Manmatha is Manaha Mathnati iti Manmatha. One who churns your mind is Manmatha. Manmatha is Mathanam. Mathanam is churning. Manmatha means one who churns the mind is Manmatha. So this Manmatha is a person who churns all our minds. So he is also called Kama, desire. So he shoots arrows. And Shiva, temporarily he opens his eyes and looks at Parvati. But then he wonders as to why his mind wandered. Then he just looks at this man, and then the Jnana Netram. With the moment he opens the Jnana Netram is, that is realizing that this Kama is a stupid fellow who is trying to seduce me. And then with that Jnana Netram, the Kama is reduced to ashes. So what is the symbolism here? That the contact between a man and woman has to be a very pious contact. It should not be based on lust. It is not something based on lust. It should be something based on proper understanding, education, love, and it is a sort of tapas And in Indian tradition, the marriage between a man and woman, the marriage is marriage naturally between man and woman. The marriage is a sort of sacred affair, a sort of sacred, a very sacred institution. And dharma praja utpadanartham, that is, in order to produce children who will preserve dharma, in order to produce, offspring who will continue this dharma, that is the objective, not lust or not like that. So it is not some type of sexual contract. It is not a contract as it is happening in the Western world now. So ours is a very sacred bond. So Manmatha, what is the story indicates? What does the story indicate? It shows that the lust is not the basic factor in marriage. It has to be love. It has to be education. If you see the description of Rama and Sita in the Balakanda, at the end of Balakanda, we will see how gloriously it is described. So this, and another message which we see here is, action without desire produces the result, which helps the divine forces. So in the marriage, this is also a message for good marital relationship. So the marriage is something, not that sex should not be there. Sex will be there naturally, but then it is not something which is like an animal sex or lustful thing. It is something which is defined, which is a sort of refined, cultured type of relationship between man and woman. So then, similarly, you come to, for example, one more story very, very briefly in 2 minutes, and then I will complete. For example, Prahlada. What is the meaning of Prahlada? Hlada means happiness. Pra means a sort of prefix only. Pra is a prefix. Prahlada means a person who is extreme, who is very, very happy. Who is a person who is very happy? A person who has absolutely no desires. A person who is staying in the awareness of God. A person who is, luckily for Prahlada, even when he was in the womb, sage Narada came and then he was telling all those stories about Vishnu to Prahlada's mother. And Prahlada became a jnani, even at that time. So Prahlada is a man who is contented, who is very, very happy in the knowledge of that Lord. Whereas Hiranya means gold. Kashipu is some type of mattress. Hiranyakashipu is somebody who is keeping all the gold. All gold has to be there. It has to go into his mattress. And Hiranyakashipu is one man who acquires so many bones. I should not be killed by this. I should not be killed by that. I cannot be killed by a human being. I should not be killed by any other gods or demons or anybody. And I should not be killed during day or night. I should not be killed in the house or outside the house. So many conditions he had put. So, but then, what does Hiranyakashipu symbolize? He symbolizes all this arrogance and avarice, greed, and desire to rule the world. And now, how to beat him? So, in order to beat him, the Lord also had to fulfill all those conditions and come in the form of a lion man. Neither a man nor an animal. So his condition was, it should not be a man, it should not be an animal. So it is neither a man nor an animal, no weapon. So he had to be torn off with fingers. And again, not in the house or outside the house. So keeping on the threshold. Neither day nor night. That is sometime in the evening, dusk time. So like that, Narasimha, the Lord had to fulfill all the conditions. Like the anti-corruption people. Suppose somebody is a highly corrupt fellow who is taking all types of precautions. The anti-corruption people also, they should also be very intelligent, and then they should see that all those things are properly explored. So like that, so the Narasimha's avatar, it shows that is basically to say this Hiranyakashipu represents greed. So this Narasimha is somebody who is destroying that greed, that incarnation of greed, let us say, that whole personification of greed. So I think now the time is over. There is a lot more to say. So if you have time, maybe we'll have some other sessions. If you are not having time, then right now we'll end with this. I have given some introduction to Hinduism. Maybe we'll see later. If there is a chance, we'll again meet. Harihi Om Tat Sat.